Our love is so sweet in the springtime, when blossoms are fragrant in May. No years that are coming can bring time to make me forget you this day. I love you in life's gray December, the same as I love you today. My heart ever young will remember the thrill it knew the day in May. Sweetheart, 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 will you love me ever? Will you remember this day when we were happy in May, my dearest one? Sweetheart, sweetheart, sweetheart.
World War I began when Serbian terrorists assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in June 1914. Emperor Franz Joseph and Austrian leaders felt in order to protect the empire, they needed to destroy Serbia. Players in the deconstruction of Serbia were the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey on one side, and the Entente, or Allied powers of Serbia, Russia, France, Belgium, Great Britain, Montenegro, and Japan on the other. Most of Europe was at war by 1914. But under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson, the United States did not enter the war until April 1917.
Ten million soldiers to the war have gone, who may never return again.
But long before the U.S. entered the war, American men of all races and social statuses boldly ventured into the war alongside the French, many of whom were pilots. The following is a compilation of reenactments and real footage. This is a German dirigible captured by the British being used for an observation balloon taken from an airplane above the balloon near Kingsland, Norfolk, England.
In every eye as the boys go marching by, what they're out to do, I hear them play. All the things you plan to do, I am sure they will come true, and I'll walk and wait for you over here. Au revoir, but not goodbye, soldier boy. Brush that teardrop from your eye, soldier boy.
The life expectancy of a pilot in World War I was 20 days. More Americans lost their lives in World War I than in the Vietnam and Korean Wars combined. Aviation was an essential strategy in warfare, but new methods such as trench warfare and poisonous gas were introduced on the battlefields, and their effects were devastating.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Into
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
Good afternoon. Augustus Peabody Gardner was born on November 5th, 1865, to Joseph Peabody Gardner and Harriet Amory Sears Gardner. His parents died before their son reached the age of 10, and his two older brothers were subsequently raised by their uncle and aunt, John Lowell Gardner and Isabella Stewart Gardner, famously known as Mrs. Jack. The family lived in Boston during the winter months and summered on the North Shore in Beverly. Young Augustus was educated at Hopkinson School in Boston and at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, where he demonstrated a proficiency for challenging academics at an early age. He entered Harvard in 1882, graduated in 1886, and following graduation worked in the family business as an accountant. He acquired through purchase and inheritance Sagamore Farm in Hamilton, Massachusetts in 1886, and established himself as an industrious gentleman farmer raising Jersey cows and thoroughbred horses. He became a member of the Essex County Agricultural Society and eventually a shareholder of the Myopia Hunt Club, where he played polo and rode to the hounds. In June of 1892, Gardner married Constance Lodge, daughter of the prominent congressman, the Honorable Henry Cabot Lodge. At age 32, he registered and entered the Spanish-American War as captain, then colonel, and was promoted to assistant adjutant general. He served in 1898 and saw active combat at the Battle of Coamo. As a soldier, his commander, Major General James Wilson, said of him, "He is a very able man, is patient, painstaking, exact, and untiring in his work. Nothing ever deters him from getting to the bottom of any question or of carrying through any duty entrusted to him." Tributes, like those of his commanding officer, followed Gardner in every discipline he undertook for the rest of his life. Gardner, a member of the Republican Club of Massachusetts, where he served as secretary from 1899 to 1902, was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 1899. In that position, he was the author of a number of innovative bills, among which was the subway bill for the construction and ownership of the transportation system in the city of Boston. Numerous other resolutions that he developed were approved during his time in office, and as well, Gardner was chairman for the Committee for Industrial Arts and Expositions. In 1902, he was elected to the United States Congress, representing the 6th Massachusetts District, where he was a member of the Ways and Means Committee. When the war broke out in 1914, Gardner was determined to fight in the debacle that was happening in Europe, as he was concerned that it would ultimately affect the United States. He made the critical decision to resign his duties in the U.S. Congress on May 22, 1917, and he rejoined the U.S. Army. He willingly surrendered his previous and prominent rank of colonel and agreed to a demotion to the rank of major. The country and cause he served meant far more to him than the significant reduction of rank and status. Gardner's first military assignment was in New York at Governor's Island, and then at Camp Wheeler in Macon, Georgia. This facility was a tent camp and was completely unprepared to accommodate the troops. He worked tirelessly at Camp Wheeler, always hoping and expecting that deployment for combat in Europe would come any day. His greatest desire was to defend his country overseas, but much to his chagrin, that wish never materialized. But the service he performed for his country in and out of uniform was exemplary and was always held in the highest regard by his peers, military colleagues, and recruits. For his selfless nature as a civilian, a politician, and in military service, Gardner was awarded the Spanish Campaign Medal for his efforts in the Spanish-American War, the World War I Victory Medal, and ultimately the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously in 1923. Augustus Peabody Gardner, at age 52, succumbed to pneumonia at the base hospital camp at Camp Wheeler in Georgia on January 14, 1918, never having seen combat in France that he had so greatly anticipated, and he was interred at Arlington National Cemetery. His passing at such a relatively young age stunned all who knew him. In the U.S. House of Representatives, Wilfred W. Lufkin, who had succeeded Gardner, paid tribute in saying, "With the same courage which he ever displayed as a member of this House, with the same fortitude which characterized his action when the President called for volunteers, Augustus P. Gardner cheerfully answered and gave his life as a sacrifice to the cause for which he had not only preached but practiced. Mr. Speaker, there will probably be many more sacrifices of good and true men before this terrible war is over. But when history is finally written, when the toll is at last complete, I am proud to think that there will be no soldier, be he officer or private, of whom it can more truly be said, he was a man, take him for all in all, I shall not look upon his like again." Thank you.
I would like to invite Vince Jones to share this dedicated airman's story.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking of Sergeant Norman Prince, who was first cousins to my maternal grandfather, Gordon Prince. Norman was born on August 31st, 1887 in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. His parents were Frederick Henry Prince, who was a well-known financier and industrialist, and his mother, Abigail Kingsley Norman Prince. His grandfather, Frederick O. Prince, had been mayor of Boston. His family owned several properties in Massachusetts, one being Princemere in Wenham, which became Gordon College. Military funeral services were held in France on October 20th. Norman Prince's body was initially interred in Luxeuil. His remains were later placed in the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Tomb at St. Cloud near Paris. It remained there for 20 years. Then, in 1937, his father, Frederick, had it moved to what would be his final resting place, an elaborate tomb within the National Cathedral down in Washington, D.C. And on his tomb read the words, "They led where a nation followed." There are many memorials to Norman Prince. The Norman Prince Neurosciences Institute was established by his family at the Rhode Island Hospital. He had been honored in Massachusetts by the DCX, which is the Drum Corps Experience. In Melrose, Mass., there was a Veterans of Foreign War post named Lieutenant Norman Prince Post 1506, and that was established in 1946. There's a group called the Princeman Drum and Bugle Corps, and in Malden, Mass. In the same year, the Lieutenant Norman Prince Renegades were formed. Both are part of the Drum Corps Heritage Society.
Back in the U.S., Wilson was faced with facts that make it nearly impossible to resist entering the war.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the U.S., Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the U.S. and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the U.S. into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the material, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
The United States will fight only as a champion for the rights of mankind to make the world safe for democracy. Many young Americans had volunteered to fight alongside the French, but Wilson knew this number would not be adequate to stop the Germans. He signed the Selective Service Act in May 1917. Men 21 to 35 had to register for the draft, which made our prior army at 200,000 a solid 4 million by the end of the war. No one was excluded from the draft. Though we fought, Wilson had a vision for restructuring after the war. In January 1918, he delivered an address before a joint meeting of Congress known as the 14 Points. These points outlined his vision for stable, long-lasting peace. He itemized 14 strategies to ensure national security and world peace.
It's time to place a musket on his shoulder and wrap the stars and stripes around his breast. It's time to shout those noble words of Lincoln and stand up for the land that gave you birth. That the nation of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Victory gardens, farmerettes, 4-H clubs, and war bonds are just a few of the terms that described life in America during the war years. While husbands, sons, brothers were overseas fighting, women and children were keeping the home fires burning and hoping always their loved ones would return. Home fires and factories, farming and rationing is what kept America going during those years. When they had finished those tasks, they often joined their mothers in victory gardens, tilling the soil, weeding and watering, while other resources were conserved and sent overseas to the fighting men. Lieutenant Samuel P. Mandel II enlisted just 29 days before Wilson declared war. I'd like to invite Charles Rice Kendall to share Lieutenant Mandel's story.
Lieutenant Samuel Pierce Mandel II would be my great-uncle, my grandfather's uncle, my grandfather was born in 1918, and his wife is sitting right here in the front row. Great-great-uncle. Thank you. Samuel Pierce Mandel II was born in Boston on March 20th, 1897, to parents George Snell Mandel and Emily Proctor Mandel. George Mandel was owner and editor of the Boston Transcript, the leading newspaper in Boston. They had a home on Commonwealth Ave in Boston and an estate in Hamilton. Much of Mandel's childhood was spent at the family home, now Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, right here in Hamilton, full of horseback riding, hunting, polo, steeplechasing. Mandel attended Noble and Greenhouse School and St. Mark's School, class of 1915, and entered Harvard University as part of the class of 1919 with several honors. Barely more than a teenager, Mandel left Harvard during his sophomore year to join his fellow Harvard colleagues who were receiving aviation training at flying schools in different parts of the East. They were focused on the serious attempt to become qualified military aviators. There was no USA Air Force at that time. Mandel and 4 others of these undergraduates from Harvard received certificates as finished aeroplane chauffeurs. Mandel officially enlisted in Newport News on March 3, 1917, and resumed flight training at another commercial school. Despite drawbacks and delays caused by lack of machines, instructors, and inferior parts, Mandel eventually qualified as a pilot in July. He then attended MIT for ground training and was commissioned a first lieutenant on November 5, 1917. That December, he embarked for France and trained in various camps throughout the country. Upon completing his training in September 1918, he was assigned to the 20th Aero Squadron, a group with the First Day Bombardment Group. He was sent to the front, based initially at Toul and subsequently at Moulins. The squadron's very first flight was to take part in the Saint-Mihiel drive. This is a quote: "In driving rain and hail, weather such as none of them had ever seen before, they were permitted to venture out. These untried men were sent to support the American attack." In his first flight over the German lines, Mandel shot down a German Fokker. In all, Mandel participated in 17 raids that were made by the squadron. This comes at a time when just getting off the ground was dangerous. For this achievement, he and the survivors of the original group received a citation for having shown a devotion to duty and initiative. On August 6, 1921, almost 3 years after his death, Mandel was honored at a funeral service in his parents' home in Hamilton. The service was conducted by Reverend William Greenough Thayer, D.D., headmaster of St. Mark's School. After the brief service, the body of the young World War I veteran who was in the aviation service was taken to Mount Auburn Cemetery for burial in the family plot. His body was brought to this country from France on the steamship Cantigny. It is interesting to note that the Boston Globe reported on December 31st, 1929, that Boston paid tribute yesterday to the New England aviators who gave up their lives in World War I by establishing the Memorial Administration Building and Control Tower at the Boston Airport in East Boston. There are tablets bearing the names of the New England men killed during the war. Mayor Nichols spoke touchingly of the young men aviators in public tribute to Mr. and Mrs. Mandel's cooperation in making the airport reality, the best of its type in this section of the country.
We know little about the other 5 men who the community house has memorialized, but many of them were, in fact, immigrants. They may not have originally hailed from Hamilton and Wenham, but when called upon for help, they did not hesitate to fight and sacrificed their very lives to protect the rights of humankind. Many are memorialized at the town hall. The Mothers Club of Hamilton planted a tree for these and many local fallen heroes.
George and Emily Mandel envisioned a lasting memorial to their son Samuel. In October 1920, the Mandels purchased land at the corner of Asbury Street and Main Street. Architect Guy Lowell and Hamilton builder Frank R. Trussell were commissioned to see the project through. As a tribute to Samuel, 165 family and friends of the Mandels joined together to commission a statue of Samuel for the portico of the community house. Beverly Farms native Anna Coleman Watts Ladd was selected to create the statue with Samuel's brother Thomas posing for the sculpture. The final work of art was kept secret from Mr. and Mrs. Mandel until October 9th, 1921, when the statue was presented to them along with a leather book containing the names of the 165 contributors. November 11th, 2018 marks the centennial of World War I and its armistice. The effects of the war to end all wars ultimately led to the founding of the Community House, a gift that has benefited generations of local citizens for nearly a century. Today, the Community House continues on as a nonprofit 501c3 charitable organization that is dedicated to the arts and enrichment through programs that promote togetherness and strengthen our community. Throughout each year, the Community House offers a variety of concerts, theater productions, workshops, and special events that benefit the townspeople of Hamilton, Wenham, and the surrounding communities. In 2021, the Community House will celebrate the organization's centennial. This is just the beginning of the story, I hope. There are many more stories to cover in the coming years and many more stories to write about this organization.